Imagine standing at the precipice of history, watching an empire, once a global superpower, crumble before your very eyes. The Soviet Union, a towering force in world politics for decades, was collapsing. And in the midst of it all, Boris Yeltsin, a man who had spent much of his life battling against the very system he was now leading, was about to speak to the world. December 25th, 1991. This wasn't just another day in Russia's history. It was the day that would mark the end of an empire. Yeltsin's speech was a moment of deep symbolism. It wasn't just an announcement, it was the final declaration that the Soviet Union, the empire that had shaped the 20th century, had officially fallen. This wasn't just political change, it was the destruction of a world order. The globe was watching in disbelief as the foundations of a superpower that had fought in the Cold War, a force that had governed millions, simply disintegrated. But what came next? No one was entirely sure. For millions of Russians, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a paradox: liberation and chaos. The crushing weight of decades under communist rule was finally lifted. But what lay beyond? The Soviet system, for all its flaws, had provided stability, even if that stability was built on fear. The economic struggles, the political repression, the constant threat of war, these were all realities that had been endured for generations. Now, suddenly, everything was up in the air. Yeltsin, however, was speaking directly to the Russian people. For him, the Soviet collapse wasn't just a geopolitical event, it was a personal battle. A former Communist Party member who had risen to power in the Russian Federation, he now found himself tasked with managing an incredibly delicate transition. The speech he was about to deliver would be a defining moment in his presidency, but also in Russian history. The USSR was no more, but what did this new Russia look like? As Yeltsin spoke, it was clear. The Soviet Union was dead, and it wasn't coming back. But what was emerging from its ashes? Would Russia find a way to embrace democracy, freedom, and the market economy? Or would it descend into chaos? The Soviet system had collapsed, but its legacy, the ingrained corruption, the political struggles, the economic mismanagement, still lingered. Yeltsin's task was monumental: to rebuild an entire nation from the ground up, despite the deep systemic issues that had been created over decades of Soviet rule. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't happen overnight. It was years in the making. From Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts to reform the system with glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, to the economic stagnation and political unrest in the late 1980s, the pieces of the empire had been crumbling long before Yeltsin's speech. But what Yeltsin did with his words was finally acknowledge the inevitable. He did not shy away from the magnitude of the situation. The Soviet Union was no more, and the world had to adjust to this new reality. But this moment wasn't just about Russia. The global implications were immense. The end of the Soviet Union meant the collapse of the Cold War framework, the end of the nuclear standoff that had defined much of the previous half-century. The United States, long the Soviet Union's adversary, now stood alone as the world's preeminent superpower. But with that power came responsibility. What would the world look like now? With no opposing force, would global relations be defined by cooperation or conflict? For Russia, the challenges were just beginning. The Soviet Union had been a complex network of republics, each with its own ethnic, cultural, and political identities. The collapse of the USSR meant these republics were now independent, and that brought about new issues: border disputes, political instability, and economic crises. For many of these new nations, independence was a dream come true, but it came with the harsh reality of navigating their newfound freedom without the framework of a superpower behind them. But as Yeltsin spoke, he offered hope for Russia's future. His message was clear: Russia could rise above its past. The Soviet system had failed, and it was time to move forward into a new era of democracy and freedom. His words were designed to inspire. Yet beneath that optimism, there was a growing sense of uncertainty. Could Russia truly thrive in a world without the Soviet Union? Could it reinvent itself as a democratic and prosperous nation, or would it be overwhelmed by its legacy? As Yeltsin ended his speech, the world held its breath. The Soviet Union was no more. The empire that had shaped the geopolitical landscape for so long had crumbled. But in the silence that followed, the burning question remained. What comes next? Russia's new reality following the collapse of the Soviet Union was not an easy one. Yeltsin's speech had been a declaration of freedom, but that freedom came with heavy consequences. As the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia found itself in the midst of profound political, economic, and social upheaval. No one could have predicted how difficult the transition would be, or how long it would take. The country's economy was in free fall. The centrally planned system that had dominated Russia for decades was dismantled in favor of a market economy. But the suddenness of the shift left the population reeling. Inflation soared, unemployment skyrocketed, and millions of Russians found themselves without jobs or savings. The oligarchs, the new class of powerful businessmen who had capitalized on the privatization of state assets, became symbols of inequality. As wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, the vast majority of Russians suffered. Yeltsin, in his quest to transform Russia, turned to drastic economic reforms, but the results were mixed at best. While some reforms took root, others failed miserably. The social safety nets that had once been provided by the state were gone, and in their place, a chaotic free market system took hold. For many, the promises of democracy and prosperity seemed like empty words in the face of daily struggle. Politically, Yeltsin faced opposition from within his own country. The parliament, still filled with Soviet-era officials, resisted the sweeping reforms he proposed. Tensions between the president and the parliament reached a boiling point in 1993 when Yeltsin ordered military action to dissolve the opposition. The violence that followed was a stark reminder of just how fragile Russia's new political system was. In the aftermath, Yeltsin's position was strengthened, but the political cost was high. Yet, despite the turbulence, Yeltsin remained a central figure in Russia's transition. His vision of a democratic, free-market Russia seemed, at times, to be more hope than reality. But the hope was undeniable. Yeltsin's leadership was crucial, and his words in 1991 continued to echo as Russia slowly began to rebuild itself, despite the severe economic and political challenges. The international community, too, had to adjust to the new Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union removed one of the major pillars of the global balance of power. The West, particularly the United States, found itself in a dominant position. But with that dominance came new questions. How would the West engage with a newly democratic Russia? Would it be a partner or a potential rival? The road to cooperation was long and filled with uncertainties. And what of the former Soviet republics? They were now independent states, each facing their own unique set of challenges. Some, like the Baltic states, quickly integrated into European structures. Others, like Ukraine and Georgia, faced internal divisions and external threats, particularly from Russia. The geopolitical ramifications of the Soviet collapse were far-reaching and complex. For Yeltsin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was both a triumph and a burden. He had overseen the dissolution of a superpower, but at what cost? Russia was free, but it was struggling to find its place in the world. Economic reforms had failed to deliver the promised prosperity, and the political system was fragile. But the seeds of a new Russia were planted, and the journey to rebuild would continue. If you found this journey through Russia's tumultuous path after the Soviet collapse insightful, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating stories on world-changing events. Share this video with your friends, and let's keep the conversation going. What do you think Russia's future holds? Stay tuned for more.